I think maybe we can start since it's already 5:01, and then everyone else who's entering later, they will join. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to welcome you all to this virtual event titled Justice for Victims of Extrajudicial Killings in Bahrain to commemorate Martyrs' Day. My name is Irene, and I'm an advocacy assistant at the European Center for Democracy and Human Rights. Together with my colleague Basma, we have organized this event and we will both moderate it. To give you all a bit of context, Martyrs' Day was first marked on the 17th of December 1994 by the Bahraini people because the police shot two Bahraini youth demonstrators, Hani Kamis and Hani Al-Wasti, who were protesting against the regime. This was to become the longest ever uprising, which continued until 2000. Since then, annual demonstrations have continued to mark Martyrs' Day, and police brutality has not stopped. In fact, in 2007, during another annual commemoration, a demonstrator was killed, Ali Jassim, who was only 22 years old. Once again, the regime's forces resorted to harsh measures in a desperate attempt to stop the countrywide protests. Finally, in 2011, Bahrain had its own chapter of the Arab Spring, where thousands of young Bahraini citizens peacefully took the streets, demanding justice, democracy, self-determination, and advocating for human rights. They were chanting, "People want the downfall of the regime." Nevertheless, the reaction from the government was severe. Citizens were killed, tortured, arbitrarily detained, and sexually attacked. I will now give the floor to my colleague Basma, who will introduce today's panelists and who will give us a better understanding of this issue.
Thank you, Irene, for the introduction. In today's discussion, our panelists are going to shed light both on the historic aspect of this struggle and on what kind of justice we could have for these human rights defenders who were killed while defending their rights for self-determination in Bahrain, a struggle which is still ongoing today. It goes without saying that the purpose of this event is to create a fruitful discussion on the topic. So please feel free to write in the comment box any questions that may arise as each panelist speaks, and we will have a short Q&A session towards the end. And now, without further ado, and to finally begin today's discussion, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Jen Marlowe. Jen is a Seattle-based award-winning author, documentary filmmaker, and human rights activist. She filmed Witness Bahrain over the course of 3 weeks, securing interviews with dozens of Bahraini activists and citizens. She will now screen an excerpt of her film, which will allow our audience to witness a first-hand testimony of police brutality towards peaceful youth protesters. And just a side note, before I give the floor to Jen, if the audience has any questions directed at her, if you could please write it on the comment box as soon as possible, as she will need to leave earlier. And Jen, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Basma, and it's an honor to be with all of you today and to be commemorating Martyrs' Day together. As Basma said, I was in Bahrain for 3 weeks in 2012, which was really the filming. I was trying to film the aftermath of the crackdown that had happened in 2011, and really looking at what are the long-term consequences in the lives of human beings of this kind of state repression. And so often with the media cycle, especially in my country, which is the US, which of course, as folks on this call knows, props up so many of the human rights violations of the Bahraini regime and other regimes around the world. And the news headlines just go so quickly that we maybe hear about the murder of a protester, but we very rarely have the chance to really consider what is the impact in the lives of the family members, the lives of the loved ones, the human impact of this kind of repression. And so that's what I was trying to focus on in the filming. And I'm going to show a very short clip from Witness Bahrain. It's just, under 4 minutes, which is the story of the killing of Ali Jawad al-Sheikh, who was a 14-year-old child living in Sitra. And I had the opportunity to meet his family and just get a little window into what their life is like after having lost their their precious little boy. Basma, for me to screen share, do I need to be made a co-host or am I able just to screen share?
I think you should be able to. I think Hussein might have made you co-host already. I don't know if you can try. If not, well.
Let me see. I think so. I think I am. All right. You're seeing my screen, right, everyone?
Yeah, perfect. Thank
you.
All
right. Let me just get the volume up on this and let me maximize it.
أم علي؟ هلا والله هلا. سلام. زينب.
طبعا هذه صورها كان في الدوار.
This was in the prayer roundabout.
وهذه في الدوار مكتوب عليه.
And this one as well.
طبعا هذه كانت العيد العام، كان يضحك ورسمته شلون السنة راحت ضحكته.
إعلامي صغير، مصور صغير كان يوثق في الدوار، يوثق هنا المسيرات السلمية كان يوثقها، يعني جاهل صغير لكن مخه كبير. مبدأه هو اللي خلاه يطالب ظلم الناس، واللي خلاه يطلع ويجاهد كلها مسيرات سلمية. ما يطلع إلا بعلم البحرين، ما يطلع بحجر ولا يطلع بشيء، يطلع بعلم وراية الوطن.
هذه ولدي ضربوني يطاحون نطاق مكتوب أطلق عليه مباشر، فلما نطلق عليه كسر الحضارات. عندي صورة بعد كسر الحضارات مالي طب على وجهي.
يقرأ فيه إنه بيطلعون الحين، إن الحين بعد صلاة العيد بيطلعون الشباب مسيرة سلمية هني في الفريق. قال له وين بتروح؟ هو جهني بس شعره وقف هني على هني المنظرة، وقام بس عدى شعره ونبرزه كاوية ثيابهم ثلاثتهم مال العيد، كاوية ثيابهم وحاطتهم لنا. ولا علي أنا ثيابك عشان نروح السيلم نروح بيت بابا عود من واق قبل لا يسكرون الشارع الثاني ما بنقدر نحاصرون سترة. ما كان يسمع كلامي. أنا هني في البيت شميت مسيل الدموع، نغزني قلبك، فتحت الباب شفت أحمد أخو الصغير جاي يركض، ايش صاير بابا اللي يقول كم قناعة جو ضربوا مسيل الدموع. وين علي؟ سيدك له وين علي؟ اللي يقول وعلي مفقود، علي مفقود يعني ضربة اتصال، أنا اتصل من وعلي مفقود، كل واحد يقول لي لا ما في شيء، علي الحين بيجي. اتصل لسيد علي اللي سيد علي وين علي؟ خلوني أحاجي. سيدك قال لي علي شهيد، خلوني أحاجي. سيدك قال لي علي شهيد، وهو أبوه ما رضيوا خلونا، راح من باب الخلفي مال الأسعاف اللي يدخل وراح ودخل وشافه وحضنه بالمصاب. قلنا علي وش سويت فيك؟ شوات وجهك، شوات ضروسه. بيت علي الصغير وجاوا لي وشالوا عنه. ما سيدك ما شفت الا والله يضرب على راسه، يضرب على راسه اخوه. يوم ثاني سلموا الظهر يوم ثاني. اغراضه والله اللي اشتراها للحين ما البسها. كنا يوم نصاحتها والله طلعها ريحتها عجيبه. واحمد ليش احمد شاف الحادث؟ الله يساعد أحمد فقد ظله، أحمد فقد متنفسه. أحمد النوع اللي يعني جناحه مكسور. طفل وسرقه من حضني، وطفل جميل وديع حنون خلوق، يوم عيد يسفك دمه.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add beyond the clip, but I feel like it's so crucially important that when we're having these kinds of conversations and we're looking at policies and we're talking about, sort of the bigger picture of different kinds of repression, that we're always just remembering to center in our minds and in our hearts the ones who have paid the biggest price and the ones who have been most impacted by those policies. And of course, it is the families who until now, those holes never get mended in those families' lives. So I just appreciate the opportunity bring that one individual story to all of us as we're looking at the larger impact of the ongoing situation in Bahrain.
Thank you so much, Jen. Thank you so much for sharing us this powerful testimony. We think it is always important to make the voices of the victims heard, but also understood at the same time, as you said. For this, we have our next panelist, Tara O'Grady, who will talk about extrajudicial killings and torture practices that human rights activists have endured in Bahrain. Tara is the founder and executive director of Human Rights Sentinels. They advocate against the use of torture, government's use of tear gas, and other methods of collective punishment against their citizens to suppress opposition voices. The floor is yours, Tara.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Great, thanks. Jen, I really applaud your work. And I had the great privilege of meeting Ali Jawad al-Sheikh's dad in Geneva, and he held himself with such composure and dignity. It is frightful to think that these things continue to happen today, nearly 10 years after you and I started this work on this situation. I'm really honored to be here, and thank you to the hosts for inviting me to speak. Ian Henderson was with the British military. He became an advisor to the Al Khalifas for decades up until his death a couple of years ago. He had been involved in the Mau Mau revolt in Kenya and was notorious in his work in Northern Ireland, where he taught torture tactics against political prisoners in Northern Ireland. The continued close relationship with the British and the Bahraini royal families since Bahrain's independence, ostensibly in 1971, has meant that trade and international relations continued unfettered, and this included shared resources of intelligence, weapons and military training with the US 5th Fleet on the island, and now the recently established British naval base, which gives ease of access to police the Gulf of Hormuz and regional access to Iran. Bahraini police forces are largely naturalized from outside the country because of this feeling of sectarian divide that the regime insists on continuing to stoke inside the country. The Bahraini... Can you just all make sure that your microphones are on mute, please? Thank you. So they had been sending police to Northern Ireland to train in Her Majesty's Prison Service in the north here. The impact of this training was immediately apparent as waterboarding and electric shock treatment evolved to more sinister forms of punishment. These, the police made clear, were meant to bring the subject to the point of death, whereupon they would be revived and made to endure the process over and over again. Beatings, sleep deprivation, hangings, mock executions where the prisoner would be hooded, cuffed and in ankle shackles, marched to a place where they were shot at without bullets in the chamber. Additionally, they were threatened with the rape of their wives, sisters, mothers or children, and subsequently were raped themselves with blunt instruments. They were often tortured in front of each other to add another dimension of humiliation. Their toilet time was observed, there was no privacy. Their food was often contaminated. They were not permitted time for religious observances. The air conditioning did not work, 50-degree heat that is, and the sanitation was often disrupted and sewage was left to stink. Over the years, we interviewed ex-prisoners and family members and compiled reports on the sexualized violence against male prisoners. We thought if this was happening and was being done to the men, we really despaired for what was happening to the women. One of the more prominent male prisoners had run at speed headfirst into a wall to render himself unconscious so that the guards would not have the satisfaction of raping him while he was alert. I've been asked to speak about some individual cases, and I'm loath to say people's names, but it does need to be done. I know all of these people personally or their family personally. During that first couple of weeks, when the doctors and medics were trying to treat whoever was put in front of them, and then subsequently they were arrested for upholding that Hippocratic oath, one of the doctors, Ibrahim Demistani, was in charge of the emergency room. And I have often remembered what can only have been his horror when his own son was brought in on a trolley and died as a result of being shot during the demonstrations. And Dr. Dimastani continued to administer treatment. I want to also mention Mr. Karim Fakrawi, who was editor-in-chief of the newspaper there, the independent newspaper Al Wasat. He had adopted his brother's two sons. His brother had passed away, so he adopted the boys and raised them as his own. And he knew that they would be attending the demonstrations, so he had gone to look for them and couldn't find them. He came home, and when he had come home, the police had arrived and had turned over his house and destroyed all of his personal effects, furniture and stuff was all turned upside down. So he went to make a complaint at the police station. And the police told him to come back a few hours later. So he went home thinking that he was going back to make his statement and that it would be made in an official capacity. He did return to the police station, and then his body was returned to the family days later after he had been tortured to death while in custody himself. Now his two adopted sons are both in prison. I've worked with both of them. They're up on terrorist charges, and I've worked with them both through my human rights work in Geneva, London, and in Brussels. Another gentleman who is a brother of a human rights defender that I know, this gentleman's name is Yuna Sultan. His brother has worked with me also abroad in Geneva at the UN. Yunus was taken because of his brother's work, and it often happens that family members at home in Bahrain are attacked in revenge for the work that their siblings or relatives are doing outside the country. Yunus was taken and stripped and beaten. His clothes were taken away from him into another room, and he was anally raped and violated. And he really suffered. And when he spoke about it, he very bravely came to Geneva and spoke in the UN. He was outspoken against his torturers, and he said their names. And you could really see the lasting impact that this had had on him. He remained completely dignified and composed, but he said that what shook him to his core was when his clothes were handed back to him after they were finished with him. Some of the items of clothing were not his. They belonged to another prisoner whom he realized was enduring the same type of torture that he himself was suffering at that moment. And he felt that his heart just really went out to that person. Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja was beaten so many times, we know, but on one occasion his jaw was broken and he was left without any treatment for that injury for months. So that the tissue had started to grow around the jaw, and his face had to be rebroken in order for it to be reset. Two of the cases that involved children I want to speak about because I was directly involved with those, and it wasn't so much elements of torture, although I certainly would use that terminology to phrase what the family endured around these situations, but it's really the lack of accountability, that there is no culpability whatsoever for any of these perpetrators. And it's so vicious and depraved. There was a boy called Mohammed Al-Jaziri who was a young teenager, 15, 16 years old, and he was in the street with a bunch of other youths during the afternoon. So it was broad daylight and this was actually filmed. And so I saw the footage of it. It was at a time when the forces were firing tear gas canisters at head height. So this was deliberate. You know, they're trained to fire in a way that means that it's for crowd control or as a deterrent. But this was done specifically targeting people at head height. He was shot in the head with a tear gas canister that landed right in his skull and then exploded. And so he lost his eye. We brought him to Ireland to have eye surgery here. And I met him and spent a couple of weeks with him here and brought him around. And just reminded me of my own son, who was about the same age as him at that time. And the second child that I was directly involved with assisting was a little boy who was 4 years old. His name was Ahmed Al-Naham, and he was a fisherman's son. He was sitting beside his dad as his dad was scaling fish. and a regiment came down the road, a troop of militia, police, enforcers, whatever. And the guy who was leading them had a shotgun, and he leveled it at the child. And the dad thought that, you know, this was, obviously it's quite intimidating, but the dad thought that this was, you know, could have been a game kind of, and, you know, that he was pretending to aim at the kid. But when he realized, he saw the look in the police officer's eyes, he kind of leaped in front of the child to shield the child and said, "What are you doing? This is mad." And the police officer shot, hitting the father, but also riddled the child with lead ball bearings. And the child, both eyes were hit, and he subsequently lost one of his eyes. And I'm in touch with the families from time to time. I know that he's well, thanks be to God. But what a horrific thing to happen to a little boy. And subsequently, the regime said that the child had been hit in the face with fish scales from the father peeling the fish. So there's absolutely no intent whatsoever on holding anybody responsible for these things. A most recent indignity to add to the long list of deprivations, which include lack of access to adequate medical care, the political prisoners are now ordered to submit 5 phone numbers, and that they will not be permitted to make calls to anyone outside of this list of 5 people. You can imagine people who are long-term in prison for years, or who have been given lifelong sentences, who have family living overseas. It's very hard to coordinate with family members when a call will be made, how to get everybody into the house so they might all hear the person's voice, that excitement and that need to have contact with their families. And now that coronavirus has happened and family visits are impossible, it just makes it more and more difficult. So they seem to be becoming increasingly creative in their efforts to silence, contain, or take revenge for any form of dissent. Finally, I'd like to say in conclusion that if this situation is not solved, and I mean by that, if the political prisoners are not released and diplomatic engagement does not begin in earnest, democratic principles continue to be flouted with no access to justice for those aggrieved, then we will see this situation played out, not like The Crown on Netflix in a dramatized version, but in front of the International Criminal Court. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Tara, and thank you specifically for your detailed account on the topic. I hope this has allowed our audience to better understand the various inhumane practices that the Bahraini government forces the human rights activists and citizens to endure. And on that note, and before our next panelist, we would like to show you all a very short video which highlights the severity of the situation in Bahrain today. As it stands, there are currently 12 activists that have been sentenced to death and are being tortured. Now with our next panelist, Stephen Bell, we will look at the complicity of the British government through their direct and indirect support of these extrajudicial practices undertaken in Bahrain. Stephen is the National Treasurer of Stop the War Coalition and the former head of policy for Communication Workers Union. I'll now pass the floor to Stephen.
Thank you, Basma, and thank you, the European Centre for Human Rights and Democracy and Human Rights, for giving us this opportunity to remember Bahrain's martyrs and consider its future. Like Irene, I want us to recall Hani Khamis and Hani al-Wasti, and also let us recall the martyrs who have fallen since the Pearl Roundabout uprising. The regime can turn concrete to rubble, but it can never erase the heroes who we choose to remember, nor can it erase the indomitable spirit of Bahrain's freedom-loving people. My focus is on the complicity of the British government in maintaining the Al Khalifa dictatorship. The policy of the British government, as laid out in its 2018 Global Britain document, reads, "Our long-term objective is to see the Middle East return to stability. Central to this will be maintaining strong relationships with stable countries in the region, particularly in the Gulf." Now, let us leave aside the fact that Britain and the US have regularly been waging war in the Middle East, which has created the instability. Instead, let's concentrate on the meaning of, quote, maintaining strong relationships with stable countries, particularly in the Gulf. There's no mention of reform. Stability is more important than reform. Successive British governments, in supporting the long stability offered by the Al Khalifa family, know perfectly well they are undemocratic and repressive. The British government finds this embarrassing, as they're supposedly committed to democracy and freedom. So British policy is also one of long-term coaching of the Al Khalifa family as to the benefits of reform. This was evident in the recent visit of Home Secretary Priti Patel to Bahrain. Patel said in her statement, "I am committed to supporting Bahrain as it continues to make important reforms." She didn't mention any of these reforms, nor did it trouble her to visit Muharraq Governorate Police Station, despite it being used as a torture centre. Reform is nice, but stability is better. I looked at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office most recent human rights and democracy reports published in July and November this year. It's the same old story. Vague references to progress made, usually referring to oversight bodies that the British government helped to set up with the Bahraini regime. Anyone with a critical eye can see there is no substantial reform underway. For example, the July document suggests there has been progress on freedom of religion or belief. Yet Sheikh Al Salman received a life sentence in 2018. More recently, on December the 9th, Salman Al Adhrb has been detained.
Sì, sì, no, questa.
Sorry, could everyone mute their videos, please?
Okay. Sorry. More recently, on December the 9th, Salman Al Adhrb has been detained after being arrested for his religious views. Basic freedoms and rights are easily demonstrated. So is their absence. The November document looks forward to the new press law, yet it notes that Bahrain is 169th out of 180 on the World Press Freedom Index. And is this press law, this new press law, going to allow the independent newspaper Al Watan to be allowed to publish? Freedom for religious belief, freedom of the press, the right of assembly, the right to vote, the right to establish political parties. These are all simple things that either do not exist or exist only in a mutilated form in Bahrain. The British government is quite at ease with this stability, despite the occasional embarrassment. The British government was embarrassed by the People's Uprising in 2011, so it suspended arms export licenses. This didn't last long. In the last 3 years, the British government has authorised £34 million worth of arms sales to keep the Al Khalifa family stable. The EU has been equally supportive, with £154 million in the same period. The British government is anxious to assist the US government in its new Cold War with China and maximum pressure upon Iran. The naval base in Bahrain, along with the even newer naval base in Duqm, Oman, offers a key tool in supporting US maneuvers. That is what really matters. Issues of reform and indeed the very sovereignty of Bahrain do not matter at all to British imperialism. The Stop the War campaign continues to support the struggle of the people of Bahrain. We call for an end to British arms sales, a closure of the naval base, and support for Bahrain's independence and freedom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for highlighting the relationship between the Bahraini and British government, which it not only shows its complicity, but also the international support that Bahrain continues to receive today. Last, but certainly not least, our final panelist, Syed Haddadi, who will cover the topic of Bahrain today by focusing on freedom of expression and the role that civil society plays in ensuring political reform. Syed is the head of communications at the Arab Reform Initiative. He previously worked for Amnesty International as a Middle East and North Africa researcher, where he covered Bahrain, Egypt, Iraq, and Tunisia. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm really glad to be taking part in this, and I'm happy to be joining my dear panelists. And I think what I'm going to do, because I think there's some stuff that was already said. So what I'm going to do for my presentation is basically try to give an assessment of what happened over the last 10 years. I know that's a lot, so I'm going to just try to pack it as quickly as possible, and then so we can open up the discussion for more questions. So I think, as Irina said, I think I worked for Amnesty International on Bahrain in particular between 2014 and 2016, during which I visited Bahrain twice for research missions as well as for government meetings. And at the time, Amnesty International was the only organization allowed to visit Bahrain. So I'm going to give an assessment of what happened since then, and then take stock of the democracy and human rights situation in Bahrain today. So I think what happened in 2011, when the Bahrainis took to the street to demand justice, an end to inequality and especially marginalization, the Bahraini authorities, which is now well-documented history, reacted by using excessive force. Protesters were beaten and shot at. Opposition activists were detained and tortured and imprisoned, and violations really that elicited an outcry both at home and abroad. So the authorities at the time, to placate criticism, the government responded by appointing really flying experts like international human rights experts to lead the Bahraini independent, and I stress that, independent commission of inquiry to investigate alleged human rights violations. But it gave the commission a tight timetable to complete its task. In November 2011, Biki submitted its report not to anyone, but to Bahrain King personally, and at the time King Hamad publicly in a royal ceremony committed the government to accepting its findings and implementing the recommendations of the Biki. In essence, really, Biki concluded that security forces had committed indeed torture and lawful killings, and that Bahraini courts failed to deliver fair trial at the times. It recommended legal and institutional reforms to halt and prevent any repetition of such abuses, and called, obviously, like other investigations, like other commissions, for further investigations to ensure accountability for the abuse that took place then. What the government did after that is that it took the Biki report and its announced commitment to implement its recommendation as a sort of strategy to deflate political tension at home and to deflate criticism abroad. So it tried to hide behind the rhetoric of reform citing institutional and legal amendments introduced at the time, like the Ombudsman, these new institutions that were really key institutions for accountability to happen. But then when you put those institutions to the test, as I'm going to explain, they didn't deliver the promised goods. So I think during that period, the authorities really bought time to before the facade came down. So at the time, the authorities were talking about promoting reform and human rights, but at the same time, violations that were mentioned by my previous discussant panelists continued to take place. Protests continued to be banned. Security forces continued to use excessive force against protesters. Government critics continued to be targeted for imprisonment and harassment and intimidation. Where the new institutions were put to the test, the outcome was clear. They failed. We, as Amnesty International at the time, we were engaging with the authorities in a number of correspondence and meetings to put before them cases that we investigated independently, where we went to speak to the families, documented the statements from the lawyers and from those who were released from imprisonment at the time or who faced other violations, and we put the cases before these institutions, especially the Special Investigations Unit. And the outcome was that these investigations took too long, and at the end, no one was held accountable. If you look at the record of the police officers who were held accountable, it's a laughable matter. It's people who, low-ranking officials, mostly with no a real authority over what's happening inside police stations, or when the security forces are facing and shooting at peaceful protests. So the authorities seem to be, when at the time when they set up the institutions, they seemed in their head, I think they seem to be expecting applause for the mere fact that they set up these institutions. So when you come to criticize them or question their assessment, they didn't like it. They think you're pushing too hard new institutions. You should give them time, and they used a lot of excuses that these are new institutions and they need to be given time to do their job. So with more international pressure at the time, rather than embark on meaningful reform, the authorities started to backpedal on reform. And I think since June 2016, the authorities, the government has imposed severe restrictions on civil society and political activism, including by arresting, intimidating, and banning from travel activists, and closing any space for democratic activities to take place, and with increasing, as Tara mentioned, increasing reports of torture by security forces. But I think for me at the time when I was about to leave Amnesty, but for me at the time, the key event was really that tipped the balance toward further repression was the arrest of Sheikh Ali Salman and his later trial and sentencing. That was a clear sign that the authorities were not really interested in reform. And so with the silence of the international community at the time and the support of the allies, of Bahrain's allies, the authorities just deepened the human rights crisis by shutting down any democratic space in the country. In the same year, they disbanded Al-Wifaq, the largest political society in Bahrain. They banned Al-Wa'd the following year in 2017. They closed Al-Wasat, the only independent newspaper in the country, and they went after opposition activists in an attempt to silence them. They arrested and tortured and unfairly tried opponents and critics. And all this happened just ahead of the 2018 elections that were held with no political opposition participating, and seemed in the view of the authorities to really seal their package of reform, ending therefore any hope of a political opening in Bahrain. And the following year, 2019, the authorities went after its critics on social media. So the only space that was left for a criticism of the authorities, for calling for reforms, was shut down, and you have the public prosecution issuing repeated threat to prosecute any such behavior or critical behavior online. So torture continued to be reported in prison, and conditions remained harsh and sometimes without visits. And for me, really the big setback is the return to executions. Dozens are, as it was said before, dozens are on the death row today, and their death sentences were issued after unfair trials tainted with allegations of torture. So with the human rights defenders, journalists, civil society activists, really the key actors of change in prison or under constant harassment and intimidation, there will be no meaningful reform in Bahrain. Without the participation of the opposition and without addressing human rights concerns, there will be no real solution to the political and human rights crisis in Bahrain. Without opening up to international security, Bahrain hasn't allowed any UN experts or other international organizations to enter and do their job in Bahrain. So without this opening up to international security, there will be no accountability. The institutions, the authorities have set up and entrusted with ensuring accountability have clearly proven to be biased and lack popular trust for them to continue to do their job. So I think there's a big call on the international community, including the EU, the US, and others, to really press Bahrain to deliver real reform in order to secure lasting peace. In front of this, I think that the challenge before the Bahraini activists and the Bahraini and international human rights organizations is to find ways to navigate the challenges ahead. I think Bahrain is now emboldened because of regional factors, because of what's happening in the region, and the international human rights organizations, as well as civil society in Bahrain, including the Bahraini diaspora, because a lot of the activists were forced to leave the country because of harassment. They all need to develop further agility in order to build new and innovative networks to continue to press Bahrain and its allies for change. And I think that I hate to paint like a gloomy picture, but I think without like clear messages from the international community, the situation in Bahrain will not change. And fortunately, the peace that the Bahrainis are looking for and will not be attained. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Syed. We can now open the floor for our Q&A session. So if you haven't sent in your questions yet, please feel free to type it up in the comment box as we proceed. I think we already have a couple of questions, and I'll read the ones addressed to Tara first, just because of time constraint, as she will need to leave soon. So the first one to Tara is, you have met with victims, documented their cases. Could you tell us what is the most difficult aspect you face personally in this process? And also, how complicit is UK and US in the ongoing systematic human rights violation in Bahrain? That was to you, Tara.
Okay. Let me just kind of give a bit of a general answer, if I can do that. Because I looked at a couple of questions that were geared towards me there. The most difficult element that I faced, I suppose, has been specifically having people who were victims who came to Ireland be followed by spies from Bahrain, and to ensure that they were safe while they were, I suppose, under my care here, to make sure that they didn't have any that they weren't in danger while they were in the country. But quite frankly, the most terrible result of this was when Nabil Rajab was arrested, and the last time when he was imprisoned, because he had just gone back to Bahrain after being in the UK and Ireland, and he had been on a television program here in Dublin that I was also a panelist on, and he was speaking about the situation at home, and the footage from that Irish TV chat show was used in court as evidence against him for spreading false information about the country. And I felt directly responsible for that. You know, how naive of me to think like that, and to, I suppose, an element of arrogance in it as well, that I thought that that there was something that I did to encourage these people to be even worse than we knew that they were. But that weighed very, very heavy on my mind, and I never really came to terms with that. Very quickly, somebody had asked about the ramifications on young people and the younger youth as a result of their friends being killed or being imprisoned or whatever. I think that we sometimes, us outside, sometimes lose sight of the fact that Bahrain it's a highly educated polity with great IT skills, and the people are determined to persist without violence, which is one of the basic Shia belief tenets. It's peaceful, one of perhaps self-defense, but certainly not of provocation. I think that the young people that I've been in touch with are keen to advance their education and international relations. You have to remember again that this is an absolutely tiny island. It's smaller than Luxembourg. It's, like the city of London, just out that suburb of London, Greater London, it's only about that size. And I think that the young people now, they have no confidence in the UN system and the UN mechanisms. They don't have any confidence in lobbying the US or the United Kingdom. And I do think that they, would see maybe European allies as more potential to do something beneficial for them with regards to focusing on their plight. But they're very aware and cautious of security services and intelligence gathering and these recent normalization efforts through Trump with Israel. They're just agog that this can continue, because these young people who were 12, 13, 14 and watching their big brothers being arrested, they're now coming into their manhood, and this is continuing another decade.
Thank you very much, Tara. The next question is from Sarah, addressed to Stephen. So, Stephen, as you said, the UK has been an important ally for the Bahrain regime. Will the UK step up on the support they have been offering to the Bahrain government now that the UK is no longer tied to the EU? What can we expect from the UK in the upcoming years when it comes to Bahrain and perhaps other Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia? Thank you.
Thank you, Basma. I think it's clear that the impact of Brexit upon British foreign policy is to make it more dependent upon the United States. Both the Johnson government and the new Labour leadership are orientating towards the election of the Biden presidency, and that will affect their some elements of their policy. However, essentially, as far as the Gulf and Bahrain specifically goes, Britain will continue to maintain the same orientation towards the Al Khalifa regime and the other members of the Gulf Cooperation Council that it has at the moment, essentially because it expects the United States to do so, and together they believe that they have some sort of duty to coach the people of the region in what is right and correct in the world. Actually, what's going to happen is, I would suggest, a huge increase in tension in the region. We found out within the last month or so that there are now 15 British bases inside Saudi Arabia, 16 inside Oman. This is as well as the new naval bases in Bahrain and Oman. So we are now talking about a situation of the largest British presence in the Gulf since 1971. This is all premised on the continuation of support for US foreign policy and playing the role essentially of subcontractor to US foreign policy. Despite the obvious decline of the United States in economic terms in the world, nevertheless, the British government believes that their best bet is to get a morsel of something from the United States. So things are going to be extremely difficult. It is therefore an extra incentive to activists to place whatever pressure we can upon the British government, because it is only by combining our support for the struggles of the people of the region of Bahrain with their actual struggles that we can expect progress. The British government is vulnerable to pressure, but at the moment, most of the pressure is more closely aligned with United States priorities rather than its so-called responsibilities for promoting freedom and democracy.
Thank you very much, Stephen. We have the next question is from Katie, and it's directed to Syed. So you say that there needs to be a clear message and or pressure from the international community for any real change to occur. What kind of message and from whom do you believe would be the most effective?
Thanks. I think that's an important question, because I think when governments meet, whether they meet as part of, if we're talking about the EU, or they meet like as the US, or individually as European countries, I think that most of the time, strategic importance, economic interests, business interests take over human rights. And I think the key message, and I think so far, international advocacy organizations and also national organizations, they have been calling directly on these governments to take action, to take action on their respective national countries or national governments. So I think that what needs to happen now, it's not only MENA like advocates calling on European and US governments to take action on human rights violations, it's also the responsibility today of European and US citizens to call on their governments to take action on where human rights violations are taking place. So I think the message is not a clear one. And I think that's the challenging thing when you're doing advocacy. You have, if you're not giving a clear message to the authorities or to our government, they tend to brush it away. So you need to be too specific. And I think it takes a lot of work, and it needs to be to have engagement and a listening government for you to make that message impactful. You can meet with, for example, we had meetings with the UK government, just to take that example. When we, at the time when I was at an Amnesty, we were calling on them to actually displaying before them the contradictions between what the institutions are saying and what the conclusions of Amnesty International were. And they would say, oh, listen, we're working on this. We're working very closely with the Special Investigation Unit. We're giving them support in terms of training them. So you have to take time to let them grow, and then you can test them more. They are just sharpening their teeth to be able to deliver accountability. So I think on the clear message, I think if you want to be effective, the message needs to be as direct as possible, and it doesn't need only to come from international advocacy groups. It needs to come from citizens within government that has influence, UK, many EU governments, as well as the US.
Thank you, Syed. And one more and last question, also directed to you. Do you have any confidence in the Magnitsky Act having some promise to influence change? So as we have seen, the Magnitsky Act has been applied to other Gulf countries such as Saudi Arabia, but Bahrain remains yet to be listed. So do you believe that it might have some change, and whether or not Bahrain will be included in that list?
I think it's tricky, because I think governments tend to shy away from sanctions because they know they are not going to deliver the promises. They know that it's going to be affecting more the people who are already affected by human rights violations. So I don't think, and I think now with the the cozying up of relationship in the Gulf region, I think there will be a lot of resistance to sanctions. There will be a lot of lobby. The Israeli lobby would probably lobby more in the US to take away any criticism from the Gulf countries. So I don't think that would be particularly significant or impactful even in the situation in Bahrain.
Thank you so much, Syed, for this answer. I don't know if MP Scholz would like to make some final remarks on this meeting.
Thank you, first of all, for having invited me to take part in this meeting. I have to confess that, of course, all the consideration and the reports of the suffering of freedom fighters, human rights defenders in Bahrain are really problematic to listen to because everybody, of course, is understanding what we are speaking about. There is a clear commitment of a lot of governments and states worldwide to human rights, to social rights. I have to say, it must be the activity like yours to raise the voice of those who are silenced in Bahrain. And that is true also for other countries as well. And I became a little bit more knowledge about the situation there because we had in the last 2 years several meetings also with representatives from the Bahrain human rights defender structures. Also thanks to your organization, Democracy and Human Rights in the European Union. And I want to be very frank. There is always a split of interests. And too often human rights are used to be, human rights are used to be instrumentalized for other interests as well. And that is the case of Bahrain as well. And if the question is about the Magnitsky Act, then you know very well that even the United States are not using the Magnitsky Act they have invented for finding approaches to solve human rights violations in certain countries, in the case of Bahrain, because it's just not in their interest to have it here. And so I would say, looking into the new adopted, or not yet adopted, but initial human rights sanctions regime of the European Union, we have to look into very concrete details how it is foreseen to function, so that there is a general obligation that if the sanctions mechanism for human rights violation in third countries is imposed on them, then we have to be able to impose this sanction regime for all countries where human rights violations are taking place. And then we are coming into a very complicated debate. And I fear that also the European Union could use such an instrument for instrumentalizing human rights violations for other aspects as well. So it is depending on us that we are not letting them permit to go into this direction. Second question, of course, we are in the European Parliament, and today there was the Sakharov Human Rights Prize awarded to the democracy movement in Belarus in a ceremony, and we should stick to an awareness of all MEPs, 705 from 27 member states, that they are continuing to accompany this struggle for democratization in the national reality of a lot of countries in the world, that they are committing themselves to strive for respective policies carried out by the EU institutions and the member states, and that is then covering all the aspects. And like it in the United Nations Human Rights Council, like it be in the questions of how we are shaping international trade agreements with a strong commitment in trade and sustainable development chapters, which must be linked to human rights, which must be linked to the social and employment rights, to environmental aspects, so that the reality of partner countries of the European Union is taken into consideration, how we are shaping these bilateral relations. And here I see also the responsibility of us as MEPs, and I can only but assure you that we, at least the left in the European Parliament, will be an ally for the struggle of people in the countries where these human rights mass validations are taking place, like it is in Bahrain, or in other countries, to raise the voice, and that the voice is heard in the international community, and by that increasing the pressure on the regimes who are committing these crimes, as you have told us today, by the film, by witnesses, by the question. And probably we have to establish a close linkage between elected representatives in the European Parliament, and probably that is the case also in national parliaments, in their respective responsibility, vice versa, the national governments. So like our responsibility is to take your demands, your requests, your pressure to the EU Commission, to the External Action Services of the European Union, and of course also to the European Council. I don't want to have double standards. I don't want to have also a violation of the obligations the European Union, the member states, has taken in the international frame, and that is reality. And here I can only say, let's cooperate to overcome the crimes committed in which name ever against human beings. Each individual human being is worth to be fought for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, MEP Scholz. Thank you for your remark, and we appreciate you being here today. And also thank you to everyone for your questions, and a special thank you to our speakers as well. And just a concluding remark. So today we have seen a first-hand testimony of police brutality in Bahrain, and we have also come to better understand the practices that the Bahraini government forces the human rights activists to endure. Additionally, we have gained a deeper understanding of the support that the British government gives to Bahrain, disregarding all the human rights abuses. Finally, and on a more positive note, we have also explored the fundamental role that civil society plays in advancing democracy and human rights within the country.
As you can see, we still have a lot of work to do, and this work should not stop, regardless of whether we have Trump, Biden, a conservative, or a Labour government in power. Advocating for human rights should be a continuous process that allows us to advance towards a just society, one that upholds and respects social values. Thank you all again for attending today's event. Have a good evening and a lovely holiday.
Thank you, and take care, and keep safe and keep healthy for the struggle. Thank you.
Thank you so much.